I was involved in the hazards group of BSSRS since quite close to its inception. I just want to reflect a little bit on the origins, what it did, and then how it sort of how it changed as Business changed. I mean, the background was that there was an interest in pollution, and that sort of evolved into an interest in workers' health and the idea of bringing together trade unions with a concern about the environment, noting that in some examples, workers have felt threatened by people complaining about pollution because one option was to shut down the polluting plant and lose jobs. And so it was partly a kind of response to thinking about how to avoid that conflict, was then thinking about the pollution inside the plant. And just around that time also, there was a very inspirational project being led by the Workers' Combine in Lucas Aerospace, where Mike Cooley then was the head of the Shop Stewards Combine, and they came up with this alternative plan. What do you call it? Swords to plowshares, thinking about how a technology company that was producing a lot of weapons-related technology could do something more useful. And so they were a kind of a thorn in the side of the management, but also an inspiration to radical scientists who also talked about this kind of thing, but were pleasantly surprised to see this as a worker-led initiative rather than an academic-inspired initiative. And in fact, on a more personal level, it was an article in Science for People, which I got introduced to as a young, naive student, an article written by Mike Cooley called A New Form of Workers' Control, where he was reflecting on A, they were doing this project, and B, they were looking for alliance with individual scientists. And it concludes saying the Lucas Shop Stewards Committee is keen to enlist the service of business members, particularly those with expertise in noise pollution, toxicity, explosives, I don't know why that, and optical hazards, and write in to Mike Cooley. So I duly did as a enthusiastic young student. He said, "Oh, you should speak to BSSRS," and then I did and got involved in the hazards group. And I was in a position that a number of activists were, which is that we felt we had some either technical skills or were learning new technical language, and felt that we wanted to do something useful with this, and were quite attracted to the non-aligned, non-party nature of the collective flavor of socialism that was evident in BSSRS. And so I got involved, and a lot of other people did. And so in fact there was a rapid growth. There were local groups set up in various towns: Manchester, Sheffield, Edinburgh, Bristol, London, Birmingham, and there was contact with local trade unionists and setting up of either training activities, meetings. A magazine was produced. It was originally called Hazards Bulletin until after 5 years it got sued and had to shut down, and then it was reborn as Hazards, and that's so between Hazards Bulletin and Hazards it's been produced almost non-stop for for 35 to so years. And we've never really had any funding, so it's been an entirely voluntary activity. And although the constituency was unaligned, we did have a relationship to the left. We would often be invited. I mean, some mention was mentioned about Tim Challice, thinking we were naive bourgeois individualists. Maybe we were, but we also served a purpose. We got invited by SWP, CP, Big Flame, IMG to kind of do little health and safety workshops as part of them providing a service to the workers that they were trying to charm into their organization. So we served a purpose in terms of an alliance with them, and that reached a different audience, and so we were happy to do that. But generally, most of the people involved were, interestingly, unaligned. And we maintained a very kind of productive relationship with Busras. Now, this meeting is about kind of the broader constituency rather than just what we did. So I was kind of particularly interested in reflecting on how that relationship started and evolved, because we myself personally and a number of other people, Buzzarus was a mechanism for drawing us into a specific practical activity, which was helping in very concrete battles over health and safety, which we kind of didn't think we were going to save 1 million lives, but it was part of A, helping health in a sense, and B, helping develop an autonomous workers' movement of control over their own lives. Now, how they, the workers with whom we interacted, took that forward in terms of their own political activities was up to them. We generally didn't have a program there, but this notion of increased base rank and file control having a progressive, if unpredictable, long-term benefit was I think, central to the political philosophy of the hazards movement. And then we evolved. These local groups, then we sought to get funding, and in fact, funded centres from local authority funding were set up in London, set up in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Sheffield, either as occupational health projects linked to general practice, where the contact was more to meeting sick workers when they'd gone to the doctor with occupation-related diseases. Others, it was an office where advice was being presented, and you'll be talking a bit about the London Hazard Centre as an ongoing example of that. And as these funded centres developed, the local kind of activist part of it started to fall away, and so I got involved in the management committee of the Birmingham Health and Safety Advice Centre, and similar things happened. And so the presence of local activist groups, workers and scientists, or science students working together locally, kind of withered away. And trade unions increasingly had their own specialist health and safety officers. There was a big TUC health and safety training activity. So funded, organized activities and centers kind of took over. And so the hazards group then became a diffuse organization, still the individuals who supported and carry on supporting writing in Hazards magazine, but as a kind of an opportunity for another 18-year-old wanting to come forward and say, I want to get involved. That mechanism no longer exists. Buzzarus no longer exists as a way of feeding into that. And maybe that's appropriate, that all the activities we heard about, food, energy, pollution, health and safety at work, they've all spawned their own organizations. They don't need Buzzarus to be a framework in which to survive. And so I was kind of wondering why it was that I wasn't present at this meeting that officially decided to wind up Buzzarus, but maybe, it had it wasn't needed anymore in this example I'm giving for hazards, because, we'd set up all these different structures and it was a good place to be born, but we weren't, that parental guidance, if you like, from Buzzarus was no longer needed. So that was one example why Buzzarus disappeared. And I was just kind of thinking, another issue was also Jonathan alluded to, which was early on there were these arguments maybe between the critique, the science elite and the critique of scientists. But there was also a third constituency, which was people who were kind of wanting to do science, but weren't necessarily part of the science elite, like the young idealistic student I was at one time. And that kind of combination within Buzzarus between people who wanted to carry on doing science, who still believed in astronomy more than astrology. So there was a kind of a kind of sympathy to the scientific method, but on the other hand wanted to be critical within it. But it was an uneasy alliance between those who felt they couldn't do science anymore, but were sociologists, were political critiquers of science. And but it was an uneasy alliance, and I think that also kind of was a fracture within Buzzarus that led to its demise. And the third issue, which is the cultural context, that whether we won the argument, that more generally there isn't the deference to a neutral, benevolent science. If you read any journalist who will say, "Oh, of course, science is corrupt. Of course, it's dominated by capital. Of course, it's you can't really believe anything. I mean, the problem is that's then introduced a kind of a cultural relativism, which is reflected in the kind of a widespread belief that all vaccines are toxic and bad and don't prevent anything. So the kind of it's complicated about whether or not that suspicion of science has led to an anti-science that I now feel quite uncomfortable about. But it does also mean that the unique place that we occupied as Business kind of has disappeared as the only people who were pricking this balloon of self-importance that kind of a benevolent science was allowed to occupy at that time. So I don't know whether that's fine, and the movement has evolved and it occupies a different space now, or whether there is a space for such an organization again. But the need for individuals to get involved in an example such as the health and safety movement is still there, and I think you might refer to that. It's an alliance that did make some advances and could be rebuilt, but it had its own history within Business, as I've tried to explain. Thank you.